G'day everybody, my name's Ian, I'm the Children's Minister at Dapto Anglican Church. Over the last 10 weeks at Connect Kids on Sunday mornings, we've been learning about how the entire Old Testament fits together and how it all points towards Jesus and the amazing thing that he did for us by dying on the cross. We made 24 images and we're going to go through those now. You might have those images at home, see if you can put them in order and see if you can figure out how the entire Old Testament fits together. Well, firstly, God made the world and he made everything in it. God is a good God who loves and cares for us greatly. Not only did he make the world and everything in it, he also made people. He made Adam and Eve, and they were in right relationship with him, and everything was great in the garden. However, Adam and Eve thought that they could do things their way. So they ignored God and his right rules for them, and they ate the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And because they did that, sin entered the world. They were no longer able to live in God's perfect place. They were kicked out of the garden, and because of that, one day they would die. Death entered the world. Things weren't good. Well, as time went on, people kept on ignoring God and turning their backs on him, and it got so bad that everything was really bad. God saw the inclination of the thoughts of our hearts, and it was only evil all the time. So God decided to do something about that. He made Noah build an ark, and two of every animal was put into there. Noah's family were rescued as God sent a flood to the world to start again. Now, when Noah got off the ark, unfortunately, he wasn't perfect either, and so sin still was in the world. But God had a rescue plan. God was going to do something through a certain man's family. And so, that man was Abraham. God gave Abraham 3 promises. He promised him a land where his people could go. He said a big family and a big nation would come from Abraham in the future, and also that all people on earth would be blessed through Abraham. Now, as time went on, Abraham's family did grow. Even though Abraham was really old, he had a son named Isaac, and he had a son named Jacob. And Jacob had many, many sons. One of them was a guy named Joseph. Now, Joseph was taken into Egypt after he was sold there by his brothers, sold into slavery there by his brothers. Now, while he was in Egypt, he became the second most powerful person in all of Egypt, and his family eventually came in and was rescued from starvation as a famine hit. Now, as God's people settled in Egypt, eventually they became really, really numerous. So numerous that there were many and many and many of them, so much so that the Pharaoh of Egypt was so worried that if another nation came and fought against Egypt, God's people would join their side and fight against them and beat them. So Pharaoh decided to make them slaves in Egypt. And their slavery was so bad, their cries came out to God, and God heard their cries to rescue them from this slavery. And he sent a man named Moses. Now Moses was talked to by God from a bush that was burning but didn't burn. And he said that Moses would be somebody, through God's help, who would lead his people out of slavery in Egypt and into the promised land. And so that's exactly what Moses did. As God sent 10 plagues on Egypt, Moses took God's people out of Egypt, out into the wilderness where they met with God on the mountain. At Mount Sinai, God gave his people the law, the 10 commandments. Because God rescued them and they were now his people, this was how they were to live as God's rescued people. However, the people just kept on forgetting that God was a God who was in control. As they were about to enter the land that God had promised them, well, they didn't trust him. They didn't trust that God would win the battles for them. And because of that, they wandered around in the wilderness just outside the land for 40 years. Well, after that time, after that 40 years was eventually up, they did enter into the promised land. And things were good for them. God won all their battles. God was looking after them, and things were great. God had finally, seemingly fulfilled his promise to his people that they had the land all of their own. However, the people kept on ignoring God, and other nations came in and ruled over them for a short time. So God sent people called judges to rule over them. This guy's supposed to be Samson, who's uber strong. The judges got rid of their enemies once more, and people started to follow God again. However, as time went on, the people said, well, we don't really want judges ruling us anymore. We want a king to rule over us. And so God gave them a king, but it was the king that the people wanted, not God, because God actually should have been Israel's king. The first king was a really tall guy who looked like a massive warrior. His name was King Saul. He started off really well, but unfortunately, he wasn't the best king. Now, while King Saul was still king, there was another guy who was made king also. His name was King David. Now, he was a king after God's own heart. He followed God, and he loved God, and he led his people to the city that God had set for them, Jerusalem. And it was really great, and it was going really well. However, David, even though he was a good king, he wasn't a king who was perfect. He still sinned. But God loved David so much that he said, one time in the future, there's going to be a king who will come, who will be a king forever and ever and ever. And his kingdom will never end. I wonder if you can think who that might be. Well, after David was king, his son Solomon came along. And Solomon was really wise, but he built the temple, a really awesome thing, a sign of God's presence with his people in the promised land. However, after Solomon died, his sons started fighting over who would be king. And God's kingdom split into Israel to the north and Judah to the south. Now, Israel just kept on ignoring God. There were no good kings in Israel. There were some good kings in Judah, but people kept on ignoring God and turning to other things. Instead of worshipping God, they worshipped idols. Now, this made God pretty unhappy, that God had done so much stuff for them, but his people had forgotten his goodness and his love and care for them. So eventually, there was a nation to the north, Assyria, that came in and wiped out Israel. All of Israel were taken away and made part of Assyria. It wasn't good news for them. Now, Judah was doing a little bit better, but eventually, too, they also turned against God. And eventually, Babylon came in and wiped out Judah. God's people were no longer in the land. God's temple had been broken down, and it was just really sad. Well, some people from Judah were taken off into slavery in Babylon. That's what's called the exile. Now, God's people were there for 70 years, and that's the time when we have in the Bible the stories about Daniel and the amazing things that he did, like being rescued from the lions and his friends Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego being rescued from the fire. There were people who stood up for God even though they weren't in the land anymore. Well, after the 70 years, God's people were taken back into their own land. And they were pretty happy about that. However, it just wasn't as good as it once was. They rebuilt the temple, but those who knew what it looked like beforehand wept when they saw the new one in comparison to the old one. God's people were back in the land, but it just wasn't what it once was. And then after that, there was a period of 400 years where God's people were in the quiet from God. He didn't communicate with them. He didn't talk to them. Well, things weren't good. And at the end of those 400 years, something amazing happened. There was the birth of a baby whose name was Jesus, the king who was going to come to be able to rule forever and save everyone from their sins. And that's what we're going to find out about in the future. That's the Old Testament all together with our pictures. See if you can get them in order at home. See ya. Bye.